Okay, continuing with the video on the treaties and treaty rights. On the fiscal relations side, I highlighted for you the federal fiscal transfer that goes from the feds to the provincial governments with the health sector, social development sector, education sector, and income security. Now what we've done on the health task force, or the medicine chest task force in Treaty 6, we put together this traditional contemporary social safety net that would provide for federal transfer of the same funding directly to our governments and our Indian nations. So it's a federal Indian nations social safety net strategy that we can move ahead on implementing. And we need to look at a transition plan and how we formally put in place our jurisdiction to implement this traditional contemporary social safety net strategy with fiscal relations and financing through government-to-government fiscal agreements with the feds, not with the province. And that's major supplementary funding that you don't see, and it impacts on individuals, families, and communities. So that's what I call a traditional contemporary social safety net that would provide for direct transfer funding from the feds to the governments of Indian nations and our institutions. Now the other area I mentioned is we don't go into looking at what sources of funding exist for the financing that's needed. This is a chart that lays out the several sources of major funding that's available that we don't look at, and we don't examine, and we don't implement. And we're entitled to more than just the funding from Crown Indigenous Services. We're entitled to all the funding that's collected based on our treaties and our share of those funds. It's not all federal funding, ownership of funding by Canada. And when you look at the fiscal relations and financing of our governments, we need to be able to access all those different sources of funding arrangements that exist today. Now, in doing so then, I mentioned we need our own comprehensive budget model for the financing of our governments and the financing of every sector. And I provided information on computer of this policy document and implementation agreement document. We need to come together somehow in moving forward collectively. And this document does a lot to provide for that. And I will provide this document on the treaty right to health. Of course, it includes the inherent right to health. I'll provide this document on our own First Nations economy and what we need to do to implement that. And along with that, I'll provide this handbook on inherent rights and treaties and treaty rights. And we have a process, a bilateral process that can be used to implement and negotiate the jurisdictional laws have to be in place occupying the field, then we can negotiate formally with the feds and anybody, including the province. But the main negotiations would be with the federal government. And this process we used to use, but it's no longer being used. And it's being replaced by consultation processes instead of government-to-government bilateral relations processes, where they have to recognize our government jurisdiction and laws when they come to the table. And of course, we recognize their government jurisdiction and laws. So now when you come to the recognition of treaties and treaty rights, We have Section 35 of the Constitution Act of Canada now that provides for the recognition of our treaties and treaty rights, but also our inherent rights and Aboriginal rights. So that's recognition that's right in the Constitution, Section 35.1, but Section 25.2 still applies the Royal Proclamation of 1763, and that's the Crown's authority for negotiating treaties with Indian nations. And now they're moving ahead to negotiate with the Métis, and they've been doing it with the Inuit for some time. But the other recognition we have now of treaties, of course, is the international treaty recognition by the UN of Treaty 6 being an international treaty, and that makes treaties 1 to 11 international treaties. That recognition is there. Now we have the UN Declaration that provides for a basic fundamental recognition of our inherent rights, our treaties and treaty rights, and how we are obligated to govern the field in every sector under our government jurisdiction and laws, implementing inherent rights and treaty rights. And I'll be doing another video on the comprehensive legal political framework governing Crown Indian Nations relations, sovereignty treaty relations, nation-to-nation relations, government-to-government relations, and how it recognizes the need to implement the political relations, the treaty relations, judicial relations, economic relations, fiscal relations, and international relations, and how we implement the treaties and treaty rights under our respective governments' jurisdiction and laws. I do not understand many of our people rejecting what I talked about and what's recognized now. If they want to reject it, fine, but at least provide an alternative to what is required and how it has to be done. So that's the challenge that we have. And my presentation and videoing is uncovering what I call a code of silence that impacts on us as Indian people, governments of our nations, and the non-Indian people and their governments. A lot of this information that I'm providing has been swept under the rug when it's actual legal political facts that govern our relationship and that have to be implemented according to those instruments that I've identified and the status of the recognition that's there today, lawfully and politically. So that basically highlights and ends my presentation on treaties and treaty rights for this video. Thank you.